More and more, we're hearing about the broken connection of everyday Americans to the government elected to serve them. The topic is not new, but it seems like it's a heavier conversation of late. And the popularity of candidates like Donald Trump and Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders in the 2016 presidential race suggests that the electorate really is interested in installing outsiders into our political system to somehow break the stronghold of the current ruling class. Nick Penniman has written about this topic and about how big money controls policymaking in Washington, D.C., and he joins me now to talk about this and more. He's executive director of Issue One, an organization committed to reducing influence of money over American politics and policymaking. And he's co-author of the new book, Nation on the Take, How Big Money Corrupts Our Democracy and What Can We Do About It. He's joining me from Washington, D.C. live. Hi, Nick.
Great. Hi, how are you?
So can you sum up your view of the current presidential race in a sentence?
Yeah, well, I do think that this is the year of the outsider. It's also a year of populism. I think that the public sees that the economy is increasingly rigged against them and that the political system is too. And so what you're seeing is an appeal from Donald Trump and obviously Bernie Sanders that is directly hitting at that, and it's working. You know, I watched Hillary Clinton's speech last night after she swept all those states, and now you can see her increasingly getting on the Bernie message about money in politics and the rigged economy and all that. So it's everything's up for grabs this year. But the one thing that's incredibly clear is that the public feels left behind in this economy and with politics today, and they want it back.
So, I mean, money has always had an impact on politics. Is it worse now than it's been before?
Yeah, I've been in Washington for 14 years now, initially as a reporter and now as a reformer. And I got to tell you, the reason why I'm doing this work and why I wrote this book is because I genuinely believe that we've reached a stage 4 cancer situation with money in politics here. If you look at almost every number related to money in politics, from the rise in dark money to the aggregate rise in money in general, to the amount of time politicians spend fundraising, et cetera, they've all gone through the roof in the last decade. And it's created a situation, in my mind, in which not only do members have very little time to govern because they're spending so much time fundraising, but we also find it increasingly hard in this town to solve any problems, in part because of the distraction of fundraising, but in part, too, because the well-financed special interests have gotten so much power and control over the system that it's really hard to legislate real solutions anymore. Which
one of our major presidential candidates right now, Clinton, Trump, Sanders, and so forth, is the most entangled, would you say?
That's a great question. I suppose Clinton is. I mean, Trump is a self-financer, and he talks about it all the time and talks about how he can't be bought and everyone else is bought. You know, Sanders, his whole life, has never gotten a whole lot of money from special interests or wealthy individuals, and now his campaign is being fueled by 6 million small contributors. So Clinton, you know, if you had to rank him, Clinton would be number one in terms of her entanglement to, to wealthy donors and to well-financed special interests.
So does her entanglement mean that you would describe her as corrupt?
Her entanglement means that what I would say is that it's going to be harder for her to make certain moves with policy than it would be for someone who's less entangled. You know, I don't really believe that Hillary Clinton is corrupt. I don't believe that many people are truly corrupt. I think that it's a corrupt system. And what the system does is it distorts and bends the policymaking process away from all of us, away from the common good, and toward those who can pay to play.
And that's statistically and scientifically proven at this point. There's the Princeton Northwestern study. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so this was interesting. There's always been a question about to what extent can you claim America through data, and research is really becoming essentially more of an oligarchy than a democracy. A system that is dominated by the few on behalf of the interests of the few. And there's this guy named Martin Gillens at Princeton who led this study in which he looked at two things. He looked at public opinion polling on policy questions, so what would the public like to see when it comes to public policy, versus what the special interests, basically, the well-financed interests, would like to see. And what he found out is that there was little or no correlation between policy outcomes of what the people wanted and what the special interests wanted. So you basically, if you look at the two graphs, they kind of go like this. Here's the public interest and the public desire, and then running away from it are the special interests. So actual policy making in this country, and he looked at, I don't know how many hundreds of bills over the last few decades, has been leaning much more to the few instead of to the many.
So current law prohibits foreign political contributions to campaigns. Do we have foreigners and foreign entities contributing?
Well, I think we absolutely do, because what you have is corporations that are now plowing money into the political process, in part empowered by the Citizens United decision from 2010. And most companies, especially if they're publicly owned, have some level of foreign ownership. So I think you've got to look at that and question whether or not that's really what we want as a democracy. I would say absolutely not. But yeah, I think increasingly you're seeing that. And you also see it in spades in Washington. I mean, I was just talking to someone today who's a former ambassador and knows a lot about the Middle East, and he was talking about how the Saudis spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year, if not billions, in Washington, buying up lobbyists, doing influence peddling to make sure that public policy never leans against the Saudis in this town. So there's both the real influence of donating money to campaigns and into politics, and then there's the kind of soft influence of the lobbyist groups.
So what do we do to combat this? Is Citizens United the insurmountable obstacle?
No.
Okay, so what's the problem?
No, definitely not. Citizens United has been significantly overreported. So here's the only thing that it said. It said that corporations should be allowed to spend money in a political context, an unlimited amount of money in a political context. Okay, that's it. Now, that's not a great decision, but it also has not radically changed the behavior of the way this kind of town works and the way money in politics works. The thing that is really killing the system is that members of Congress are spending 30 hours a week fundraising. And that's not just me postulating that. There was a 60 Minutes piece a couple days ago in which they put that forth, and a Republican member of Congress was talking about that's basically what he has to spend, 30 hours a week. So when you've got guys spending 30 hours a week fundraising, and they're dialing for dollars, most of that time dialing for dollars to wealthy individuals, that's the piece that we've got to solve for. That's the big piece. So here's what you can do despite Citizens United. New ways of funding politics, ways that incentivize politicians to go after small donors and regular people like you and me instead of those who can write the, multi-$1,000 and sometimes $1 million checks. Number two, transparency and disclosure. There should be no dark money in American politics. That's not an American principle. That's not the way we work. We need to get rid of that. That's an IRS fix. And then finally, enforcement. You got to put a cop on the beat. There's a thing called the Federal Election Commission. It's dysfunctional right now. It would be pretty easy to make it functional. There's a bipartisan piece of legislation on Capitol Hill to do that. We got to get that done. So, if you do all that, if we can shift the funding of politics away from the few and to the many, if we can create transparency and if we can create full enforcement, we would have not a perfect system, but a much, much, much better system in the wake of it.
You've also said that we need to knock it out of the lefty zone. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that unfortunately, campaign finance reform and money in politics reform has been seen as a lefty cause for too long, and which is just absurd because when I was writing the book, I went back and read a lot of what the founders wrote during the Constitutional Convention. James Madison, for instance, who was kind of the secretary of the Constitutional Convention, as you know, recorded the word corruption in his diaries 53 times, okay? Now, what they were talking about with corruption, what the founders were talking about with corruption was not quid pro quo corruption. It wasn't me offering you, $10,000 and saying, here's a piece of legislation, get it passed. It was the distortion of policymaking. It was the bending of the system of government away from the common good and toward what they called back then the factions. Today we call that the special interests. That is what ultimately we're talking about here. It's a founding principle for this country. So as long as it's seen as a liberal thing or something that only liberals do, then we're never going to be able to build the kind of coalition we need to build to get legislation passed. So I think that a big part of what we've got to accomplish right now is making the case that this is an all-American cause. It's a founding cause. And that's what, that's significantly what we do with the book.
How would you rate President Obama in terms of campaign finance reform?
Yeah, he's been a serious disappointment.
In what way?
I mean, he ran saying that he wanted to eventually, overhaul the way we finance politics in this country. He promised that he would fight for serious reform when in office, and he's failed to do so.
And what about his Supreme Court Justice nominee, Merrick Garland?
Merrick Garland, it's really hard to read Garland on this issue. He did preside in a D.C. Circuit Court case that was not great on this issue, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he is personally not great on it. It just means that he was picking up on or following the precedent established by the Supreme Court. So it's hard to know, frankly.
So what do you see happening moving forward? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Where are we?
Hugely optimistic, because of this intensification factor. I mean, I talk to Tea Party people, I talk to moderate Republicans, I talk to moderate Democrats, I talk to hard left liberals, and everyone I talk to says that this is, for them, a top 3 issue right now, a top 3 issue, that we've got to solve this problem. So there is this mass awareness of what, as I said at the beginning, of this kind of stage 4 cancer. The key right now is to move forward with a bold conversation and a unified bipartisan conversation about solutions.
Nick, thank you so much for joining us. Nick
Great,
Penniman,
thank you.
His book is Nation on the Take, How Big Money Corrupts Our Democracy and What We Can Do About It. And it's out now and available everywhere.